Okay, well, we've given everyone a couple minutes, so we'll go ahead and get started here. Hello, everyone. I'm Kristen Saroff, a librarian here with New Hanover County Public Library, and I'm excited to be here today with Joe Shepard, who works in the library's local history room, and Cape Fear Museum Education Manager, Amy Thornton, for the second of our virtual book discussions for the Home Place as part of our Community Read Initiative, Read Across the County. This program is a collaboration between New Hanover County Public Library and the county's Office of Diversity and Equity, and is sponsored by the Friends of the Library. Read Across the County celebrates New Hanover County's families, diversity, and unique outdoor environment, and aspires to bring people of different ages and backgrounds together for a community-wide summer of reading. Also with me today is Claire White, our marketing and technology librarian, who is behind the scenes and who will be monitoring the chat and sending through some interactive surveys as the discussion goes along. So I think she's going to go ahead and send through the first of our polls. We are just curious if you have been to the local history room in the library, if you've been to the Cape Fear Museum, and if you have read The Home Place, which is the book we're discussing today. So you can go ahead and take a moment to answer those questions, and then we'll get started. Okay, so in his opening chapter of The Home Place, Lanham states, "These chapters are a cataloging of some of the people, places, and things that have shaped me. They are patchwork pieces stitched together by memory, and they pose questions. Where do I come from? Who are my people? Why does my blood run wild?" And throughout the memoir, he describes his family, community, and his search for those who came before him. And his attachment to the land is in many ways based on and connected to his ancestry roots and family ties to the area. And so the first quote I'd like to talk to you about, Joe and Amy, is, "I think about land a lot. In fact, I am possessed by it. I think about the lay of the land, how it came to be, what natural forces have changed it, what human forces have mangled it, how concrete and asphalt doom it. I think about the promise it holds for the future and what history it preserves from the past." And in my last discussion back in June, I spoke with Lloyd Singleton, the director of the Arboretum, about this quote in the context of nature, but we're talking a lot about family ties and history in this discussion. So I'd be interested in any thoughts you have on how our community has preserved history from the past here in Wilmington.
I'll go first. Being a public historian, I also think about land a lot, but I'm thinking about public memory and how history influences what we see, what can it tell us about the past. And Wilmington is a wonderful place to be a history tourist, right? To explore our history through the buildings and the streets around us. Some of it is very difficult history, but it's history that, Wilmington is working to tell a better story, to tell the story of. So I really appreciated the author's focus on land and taking our perspectives and contrasting them.
Absolutely.
When I was thinking about, of course, the first thing off with land, you think of the transactions of a property. And of course, with land, you can either buy it, you can inherit it, you can be gifted it, or you can marry it. And with that, you have a lot of transactions with history-wise, and particularly with the book, he mentions the land and how it had been an ancestral connection to several generations. And often when you are tracing property, you ideally trace it from person to person. Sometimes it doesn't always happen in that case. And in this case of his family, they have several members who jointly own the property. And I found that interesting because a lot of times with, even in city properties, you find several heirs to a particular site, and it might be 15 or 16. And when I drive around town, I'll see these kind of negligent lots, and you'll see houses kind of falling apart. And I wonder if that's a property has just been abandoned, or is it because it's tied up in somebody's estate and they have several heirs that need to be weeded out to figure out who is legally owning that property and how many of them jointly own it. So sometimes that explains the story. But particularly with tracing people's, either their family history, you have to start with the property a lot of times to do that. And the farther back you go, they weren't keeping track of people's birth dates or their marriages or things of that sort. They were interested in their land. And we do a lot of land research here at the library and helping people trace their deeds and other types of estate records. And sometimes you need an education in that, because property laws and inheritance, things of that sort, change as time goes on. And what might be applicable for 20th century might be different in the 18th or even earlier centuries for North Carolina.
Absolutely.
So one of the things that, I try to remember is the community of Wilmington and how it has changed dramatically over time, especially 20th century. What we think of as Wilmington has grown, and what today are, I live just outside the city limits in the south end of the county. That was remarkably rural until relatively recently. And our surrounding counties that are quickly becoming suburbs also were remarkably rural until very recently. And, in making connections back to the author's experiences and growing up in the 70s in a rural homestead that had been in his family, I think he said Mamatha had been there since I think he said 5 decades. So 1920s, raising children in the Great Depression on the same land. That's a story that it's not an urban story, but it is a Wilmington story. It is a local story here too. And those experiences he has, he may not be going to New Hanover High, when he talks about going to school, but he does talk about his friends and his that don't live on farms like he does. And he does talk about how city relatives come to visit him, which is a pattern that we see too. Northern city, big city relatives. And so I loved placing his memory, his home place in what we know of our surrounding counties, because southeastern North Carolina is very much like Edgefield.
Yes.
I like how the grandmother kept the room separate for guests and had it all ready. And I just thought about, going to visit my grandparents, and certain spaces you couldn't go to as a kid that had to be kept for only company.
Yes. Oh, yes. So the next quote I pulled out to talk about was, "I don't expect everyone to feel the same way I do about the land. For so many of us, the scars are still too fresh. Fields of cotton stretching to the horizon, land worked, sweated, and suffered over for the profit of others probably don't engender warm feeling among most Black people. But the land, in spite of its history, still holds hope for making good on the promises we thought it could, especially if we can reconnect to it." That quote really spoke to me, and I was wondering what y'all thought. Can learning about family ties and the history of an area help to build bridges between people?
Gosh. Amy?
I can go first, Dan. I'm happy. I'm always happy to talk. I'm an educator. So in thinking about, he has such a complex relationship to land. And, there's one point where he's talking about this jawbone that comes from the 96 home place. And, one of the quotes I pulled out, which I don't think is too far from the, in the book from the one that you pulled, is life sustains life. And, for him, he's very, I didn't want to say stuck. He had been stuck in this loss of land and loss of family and how intertwined they were. And he mourns that, as a starting process, I think, to write this book. And, I think from the author's perspective, Dr. Lanham, that building ties has to be built with land. That they are so connected. And he writes at the very, very end, the investment in land, he's saying the investment is called legacy. If I can see, feel, touch, and smell these things once more on a piece of land I can call my own, I'll be home again. And he means that personally, but he also does talk about it communally.
Yes. I just found the descriptions of the farm and the land and the seasons and even the foods that's mentioned as very real. And you felt like you were there. You felt like you could taste the meals that were being prepared. And in a way to tie people, you could, I find myself tied to certain places because of certain trees that are there or the meditative quality. We mentioned, Arboretum, places like that we can go and visit, but there's nothing like going to a country farm or a country somewhere and just walking and listening to the birds chirp. And I think he's grasping that. He feels that in his particular book. And, that's something we all enjoy. It's certainly one way to look at it. I know there's a lot of sadness sometimes with particular properties or particular land. But, I can let that go. If I don't know all the history of a particular site, I don't know how bad it was at what time. There was a war or battle on this site. Well, they got beaver dams now. How nice.
Right. Yeah, a history of a place keeps going, right?
Yes.
A lot of times we're marking one point in time, but that is just one point in time for the land that has, extended. We fail to recognize all too often the native history of the land that we stand on.
Yes.
And we fail to start with that often. I love that he finds arrowheads as a boy and in what he collects. It's very much like what I heard from my dad about growing up. I think that he also recognizing towards the end of the book as he's, changing how he thinks about his profession and wanting to make connections with people and reach hearts and minds. He's saying connection needs to lands, but not just this rural homestead that he loves and he has connection to, but any land, and be that an urban city park, that is a way of connection. And that building those connections is what's key.
Absolutely. Well said. So Dr. Lanham, a little later on in the book, as he's researching his ancestry, says, suddenly I realized that I did have heroes in my family, the survivors who had lived through the most inhumane conditions and had yet produced farmers and teachers and college professors. And Lanham's discoveries about his family and cultural background greatly influence his life and how he feels about his own heritage and his own land. How do you think the history of this area affects our community around us?
Oh, gosh. Well, I think we're fortunate. We still have many people in the Wilmington metropolitan area who have ancestors that go back, a couple hundred years to this site. And we know them by their last names, the place names, geography, a lot of times I've met Hewletts, I've met people who are named these particular locations, and we have that connection. So I think that's interesting. When you trace, of course, your family history, when you find out, the first thing anybody wants to know is, where did they live, and where was the house that they walked in, and to go see that. And I've had that feeling. It was like to go to that little town in Ireland and see, this is where they lived and this is where they walked. And I have that nostalgia when I find out, and it means more to me when I realize, and I've seen this with other people when they come and do research with me, when they find that X marks the spot and they want to go to that cemetery and see where the grave was. And that gives a lot of people, I guess, satisfaction when there's, particularly when you're doing your research, to see there is a beginning and an end and a great middle.
And in thinking about this question ahead of time, I struggled with this because we're such an area of non-native Wilmingtonians, right? Native Wilmingtonians are almost a rare breed. And as our area grows, that is becoming more and more true. And so as we think about family and cultural background and how they influence life, a lot of times the influences of the people around us are not ones that maybe we know of,
right,
or we recognize. Trying to think through, all of the different experiences that people are bringing to our community. They're very, very different. I am astounded sometimes with the lack of knowledge of the history of our community, because there are so many people who are not born here. And I do think that affects who we are as a community, that, certainly the community has changed and is changing as people move from outside. And knowledge of the land we live on affects how we treat it, right? It affects how we plan for the future. And so thinking about where we live and the ground we walk on is incredibly important, and something that maybe we forget. I certainly forget as a non-native Wilmingtonian. Yes. Just own that.
Now, his next quote talks about, he says, fortunately, history can be redeemed by the passage of time, circumstance, and people courageous enough to change things. And now we know Wilmington certainly has a long and somewhat checkered history. Have you seen examples of the way that we discuss Wilmington's, our history, changing or being redeemed in some way?
Yes. Well, I think with the library, first of all, the library has produced great diversity type of publications, particularly Strength Through Struggle, which is the African American chronological history of Wilmington, North Carolina, 1865 through 1950. And this piece of work was remarkable in the sense that there were very few histories written, say, particularly on a Black community, but on Wilmington history. And with this particular work, when it was produced, it was a fanfare of readers, because first of all, the size of it's a thick sized book. And the more I've used it, the more I've had it all this time, the more I use it for just answering all those little questions about the city of Wilmington, because I've come to realize it isn't just the history of a particular group of people, it's the history of Wilmington. And it gives me, businesses and names of places and schools and institutions. And some of those are, of course, gone, but they are mentioned in the history of this particular book. And I find that as one way of redeeming, how the library helped redeem a particular group of people. And we still, I still have this particular book. I still pull it out and use it. It's been out now for over 20 years, but it still holds up after all this time.
Mhm.
So I don't know that I necessarily agree with the author about history being redeemed
Mhm.
by the passage of time and circumstance and people courageous enough to change things. I think that we could write a book on that, right?
Yes.
And go a whole nother direction, perhaps. But I do think the way we discuss history and the history that we discuss has changed and is changing. It always does, right? And, Wilmington's Lie in the last, year, a little more than a year, is certainly an example of that. Not just in our own community, but nationally, changing how well known the violence of 1898 is. And again, I'm thinking back to all the people who didn't grow up here, and giving them a accessible way to reach in and learn about a complicated and hard history of our community and give them some depth to think about how history influences place and place influences history. I certainly think those are happening. The museum, I could brag on the museum all day. There are so many ways that in my decade here at Cape Fear Museum, I have seen how the stories the museum tells changes with time, and time and budget sometimes, but with the change in our 1898 gallery, we had a gallery that was 20 years old, and it was about 1898. But the way we talk about 1898 in 20 years has changed dramatically. And so, the updating of that space is a priority in museum spaces, especially when there are older spaces still waiting for updates, but making sure that we address that, how we addressed the Wilmington 10 as Wilmington 10 continued to make news in the last decade. And that, having to update museum panels to reflect changing of what we know. And then, we have been working on an 1898 field trip for 8th graders for a very long time. And pre-COVID had been able to offer that to all 8th graders in the county. Now, their school year was cut short, but we saw nearly 900 students to spend time looking at images and postcards and documents to discuss history from the primary sources, and maybe give them the tools to think about history from being able to form their own perspectives looking back at those primary sources. So it's changing. It has changed. It is changing. It will change as we learn more.
Thank you. Those thoughtful points. And then Lanham ends the book with this quote: "Home, after all, is more than a place on a map. It's a place in the heart." And so I'm just curious if y'all have any thoughts on how the history of a place can affect our own identities. Yeah.
I'll let Amy.
I think it does more so for some than others. I think about the author and his 3 siblings, and it seems like they have very different connections to the home place, and very different responses to it. He mentions once, just very, very quickly, that Jock, I think, still, the older brother, still lives there on his little 7 acres or whatever that remains in the family. And it sounds like those aunts and cousins who had a stake in the home place had a very different, it had a very different effect on their identity. And so in some ways, the history of a place does affect our identity. I think how much you live and breathe and know it affects, right? I think his place and the ecology of his area and his love for the nature he grew up in came from living and breathing it. And so I think the same is true for history of place and how it affects our identities. In some ways, I'm a born and bred Tar Heel, but I'm a born and bred Tar Heel because of so many things in my upbringing. But I know others who grew up very, with me who have very different understandings of place.
I certainly feel that the more I learn about the history of this community, the more my perception changes. And I hope that happens with other people as well. I could see that with the author as well. His perception changed. And, as you grow and as you get older, as you get wiser, the more you read, it can affect that. Sadly, sometimes it goes in reverse, though. I could see that happening with people. They get hung up on certain wrongs that they want to correct, and we lose focus sometimes as well. There's sometimes, and I always tell people about this, Wilmington has a great history, but we have a broad history, and unfortunately things get left off. And we mention, Native American history, and we mention particular smaller groups that sometimes get forgotten because the focus is on whatever is politically correct at the time or whatever is more popular. And we lose funding, we lose other things because of state agenda wants to follow a certain particular trend. But I try to see on the outlook that it's all the pendulum will swing back to different sides or to different opinions. And, history is one of those types of things. It evolves.
Yeah.
The past doesn't change, history does.
History does, yes, absolutely. Well, Amy and Joe, are there I've talked about a few quotes that I found interesting and that I wanted to dig into further. Are there other aspects or sections of the home place that you found particularly relevant to family ties and history to our own area in Wilmington that you would like to discuss?
If I may, I found the supernatural aspect of the book interesting. He talked about the grandmother speaking to the dead, and I've had that experience here with people who tell me that, and it seems to be pretty strong. I don't know if it's a Southern thing or if it's a coastal thing or something about the Carolinas, but I know those kind. I knew his grandmother. I know women like her. I met them, and he himself seems to have a bit of that touch, if you want to say. So I found that aspect throughout the whole book, just there. He didn't go into great details about it. It was just sort of a matter of fact thing. This is what's going on, and she talks to the dead, and oh well. It's just that was very interesting. I would like for him to maybe expand on that a bit more. But I found the book really interesting, and just again the descriptions of the places and just the detail of the autumn and. Just you could taste it, you could see it, and that's what I liked.
Yeah, his descriptions are poetic.
Yes.
I read and then listened to the book, and the audiobook is read by the author, and it's amazing, truthfully. Hearing the author read these words. I was struck by the sense of history that he holds. And he certainly is thinking about ancestry and future and his place between them. And then for us, the reader, he's giving us the context of what's happening in the outside world, right? The bigger world around, and how maybe Mamatha thinks about those things. Or how they watched Roots on television and what that meant for him as a kid, and how universal some of those experiences are.
Yes.
Thinking about the African-American soldiers' experience in World War I, and stationed in Germany during the Korean War. That's certainly, with the military bases around us, that's certainly an experience of so many African-American soldiers. And, I find myself, storytelling and dreaming and thinking about how he's recalling these stories of Daddy Joe, Daddy Joe's experiences as he heard them from Mamatha, that these stories of family that get passed down, he hasn't lived that. He didn't talk to Daddy Joe. These are oral traditions that are shared in his family. And it's so tied to the home place. And this tie of family and land and loss of family and loss of land is heartbreaking. He says at one point, that this is a good story gone sad. And I really felt that deeply. He brings hope and optimism back in thinking about the 96 home place and trying to give us all something to look to, with land. But I still feel that loss of the family connection to the land and the oral traditions that were being passed down. And as his family has fragmented, that he's now trying to track down pieces where, when he was a kid, those relatives were mentioning names of people that he doesn't know who they are now. And that history's been lost. So it is a book all about history and family. And, it's an ecological story, but it's an ecological story told through history of place. So I thank you for inviting me to speak about this, because I dove deep into home place, and I feel like I'm going to be giving everybody I know a copy.
Well, thank y'all so much. Now I'd like to give y'all the opportunity, Joe, to talk about the local history room and what resources we have here in the library, and for Amy, for you to talk about the Cape Fear Museum and what you've got going on there.
Okay. Well, the North Carolina room here at the library, also referred to as local history, we are open the same hours as the rest of the library. Visitors are, of course, welcome to come during the regular times. We ask you to make appointments if you have something special you'd like to look at, and we can pull that out, just because some of our collections are held off-site, or it might take us a little while to pull something. So if you have a special request or a special interest, give us a call and just talk to one of the staff members first. When you visit the special collections, we do ask that visitors bring in only pencil and paper with them. You can bring electronic items with you, but we will not allow bags or big purses or things of that sort. We will ask you to lock those up. And we follow the same policies as the State Library of North Carolina. With our collections, it is again a state and local history collection. You can find materials from all of the 100 counties of North Carolina. We quiz little kids when they come see us. How many counties are there? And you can find a history on each of those counties, as well as some record books. Now, we emphasize primarily on the Eastern North Carolina when it comes to document collection. So you'll find a lot, say, for neighboring counties, Wilmington, New Hanover, Brunswick, Pender, those places, but you're not going to find a lot, say, on Western Cherokee, places like that in the western part of the state. But when you come visit with us, you can not only trace family history, because this was a starting point for a lot of people whose ancestors came into North America, and sometimes they left some kind of a record, whether they were mentioned in a court record, whether they were mentioned in a deed, again, back to the land, we have some of those types of ways to find that person you're looking for. Then again, we have people that do all kinds of other types of things. They might be researching recipes from 100 years ago. We have a wonderful cookbook collection here. They might be looking up laws from 100 years ago, and that's become a big issue, particularly with marriage and things that have changed in this state for the last 100 years. So there's those types of resources. The collections here are for reference only. I should emphasize that point. You can't take out items, but you are welcome to look at them here. If there are duplicate items, it's just a matter of checking our library catalog. And part of my mission has been to put as many of our duplicate items out for loan. So if there is something you want to borrow, it's just a matter of checking. And a lot of times we do have that item out there on the main shelves that you can take with you. So just ask us or check the catalog. And of course, we have full-time staff that are there with you the whole time, as well as other staff members, and they're there to help you find items, or if you need to make prints or copies. And we have all those different types of machines to help you read the materials, whether they're microfilm newspapers, microfilmed records from the various time periods of Wilmington, New Hanover. And have your library card with you. It also helps a lot.
Thank you, Joe. Amy, you're muted.
I was just saying, there's so much at the local history room. I can only endorse
Yes.
what Joe had to share. So Cape Fear Museum is a regional history museum. We only focus on the 50-mile radius around Wilmington. And so, in reading the home place, that's why, this focus on something very, very relevant to Southeastern North Carolina felt so familiar.
Mm-hmm.
We cover from the first people of the region up through 20th century, and we have temporary exhibits as well. Summer's a great time to come see us. We have, some really active exhibits happening right now that are good for kids, but also adults do love play. And it's fun to see adults in those spaces too. I would also encourage everyone, since we're in a virtual space, to check out what we have virtually. That if you go to capefearmuseum.com and /exhibits, you can not only learn about the exhibits we have, but also we have some online where you can explore exhibits without leaving your chair, leaving your computer. It's something that we really increased our offerings of during the pandemic, but it's certainly really important, regardless of what's happening, to keep people home. Being able to research from your home is always, I think, where people start now. So I would absolutely encourage you to check that out. One of those online exhibits is the Wilmington Massacre and Coup d'etat. And our historian, Jan Davidson, had been working with the local history room and with other county departments to put together a interactive map of events of November 9th and 10th. And that is, what we've been talking about of history and place, and history happening in specific places. And, the memories of those events in that space. So please, check out that online resource. And then you can also see on the same website, if you go to collections, one of our other tabs, we have This Month in History, written by Dr. Jan Davidson, our historian. The one right now is about the Wilmington Steam Fire Engine Company. And one of the ceremonial trumpets, I think, won in competition. But we have, I think, 2 years worth of columns readily available online of hyper local history. And it's it's always specific to our area. It's fascinating. Jan has always pulling pictures of artifacts from our collection that relate to this history, sometimes borrowing images from the library to include in that. We have a museum Flickr page that shares all of that information. So, we want you to come see us in person, but before you get here, please check out those resources too.
Great, thank you. And I know the local history room on our library website, we have some resources available online. So now I'd just like to open it if there's any questions for the audience while we have Joe and Amy here. Claire, do we have any questions?
Not at this moment.
Okay. All right, well, we'll go ahead and wrap up then. If one comes in, we can grab it.
Oh. I do see one from Thomas Sullivan.
Yes.
Yeah, that just came through.
Yes, excellent. Okay, yes, Thomas asks, how do you think the way of life and experiences growing up in the South in the home place compare to how most people live now? Any thoughts, Amy or Joe?
So I would not be an expert on the present to be able to say how much of that continues. I think there are a lot of people who still live in rural farms, maybe not in the immediate vicinity of Wilmington, but in North Carolina, certainly, and in South Carolina, small farms are being eaten up by larger farms, certainly. Smaller farms are hard to sustain economically. That's certainly seen in the home place. When they talk about the cows having to decide if they were going to feed the cows or the family. So I think it is a way of life that has been decreasing, but then there's also this return to the land movement, right? With people trying to renew these practices. So I think it's a little of we're in a moment of change.
Yes, I agree with that. Let's see.
Looks like we have another question from Jay. Does the library and museum have any other collaborations?
I think, Joe could certainly answer this, and Kristen may want to add in also, but we have very strong collaborations between our education team and our children's librarians, that we target the same citizens in our community. We like working together. We have the same goals oftentimes. So frequently, if you see us at festivals, we're out there together, representing the museum and the library. When the library has events, frequently we're there. When we have events, frequently the library is here. And so in terms of programming, we have deep and ongoing collaborations. And then I think the story map that was a collaborative project is in part a result of changing mission with COVID. So, looking to our existing partners and when people can't be in the building, finding ways to share that information out. But we do have other, kind of natural partnerships that are ongoing.
The library has collaborations with almost every historical agency here in the metro area. And we try to help them all and give fairness, of course, but some I would say stand out more, particularly with, say, Historic Wilmington Foundation with the Port City Architecture Online. We have a great rapport with that organization in the sense that they share the materials that's gathered from that particular organization, and then the library makes it available through our website with, of course, Port City Architecture again. But that's one great thing. We also have a shared website with Lower Cape Fear Historical Society, and that their collections, we help a little bit get online and make sure that they can promote what they have there and encourage visitors to that site without, in a sense, saying, going to each site. And then, gosh, I could say name of every organization, really. The Bergwijn Wright House is someone who we speak with often. The Bellamy Mansion Museum, we have a great rapport with that organization. So, we try to be a little bit for everybody. It's a balance, you don't want to, again, give favoritism, but we try to help all those different organizations. And of course, the library is a depository for a lot of those types of organizations. And you can read their histories if you're trying to find a history on a particular organization, whether it's a ladies group, the North Carolina Cirrhosis, or say a church that's no longer with us. We have their records here. And that makes help research. If you want to research garden clubs, we've got every garden club you can think of here at Wilmington with their record books or their scrapbooks.
Yeah.
And our historian is frequently there doing so.
Jan, we know her well.
Yes. Yeah, I feel like the partnership between the library and the K-through Museum is just a very natural pairing. As Amy said, we're reaching out to a lot of the same people, providing education about, different aspects of the area. And so we're always looking for new ways to partner together, definitely. I don't see any more questions. So I'll go ahead and start wrapping up. If another one comes in, we can grab it. I hope that y'all have enjoyed the discussion today. If anyone is looking for some more memoirs from authors of color about family ties and history, like The Home Place, Claire's going to post a little graphic of some titles available through the library that you might also be interested in. Okay, so we've got The Yellow House. That's about someone who grew up in New Orleans and her experience there. The Cooking Gene, I really enjoyed this one. It's all about the history of Southern cooking and kind of where a lot of those traditions came from. The Beautiful Struggle by Ta-Nehisi Coates. He's very well known, most well known for Between the World and Me, but this is a memoir of his growing up with his father and brother. Trevor Noah, Born a Crime. He talks about how he grew up mixed race in South Africa, which is an interesting experience. Heavy is about experience growing up in the American South as a Black man, also dealing with struggles with his family and eating disorders, etc. And essays about that. Then we've got Dreams from My Father by Barack Obama. He talks about after his father dies, he starts looking into his own family history and family ties and heritage and figuring out how that all comes together to form his identity. We've got Negroland by Margot Jefferson. That, as she talks about a different experience, I think, than many people think of. She grew up in a very affluent Black community in Chicago and talks about how that experience is different than many that are talked about in other memoirs. And then we've got Condoleezza Rice, Extraordinary Ordinary People, talking about how her family really got her to where she is today. So those are some suggestions, but we've got many more available through the library. If you're interested, just come by and any of the librarians will be happy to help you with that. And I think that you'll find one of the main themes with these books, as well as with The Home Place, is how family ties and history affect the world around us, often in ways we don't expect or even realize. I think Claire is going to put up a short poll. And I do want to let everyone know that The Home Place is available to check out from the library. If you have not read it yet, we have lots of copies available. And we've also distributed copies to community partners around the county. And Claire is also going to share the link to our webpage about Read Across the County in the chat. There we go. So if you're interested in finding out about more events that the library is hosting for Read Across the County, you can find them there. We also, Amy talked about listening to the home place. We do have it on audiobook. We also had a previous program back in June with the author, Dr. Lanham, where he does talk about the book and reads portions from it. And we have that on our New Hanover County Public Library YouTube channel, if anyone's interested in watching that. You can also visit our local history room in the library, as well as the Cape Fear Museum, to learn more about the history of our region. So thank you so much, Amy and Joe, for being a part of this today. It was such a great discussion. And thank you everyone for attending and participating in Read Across the County. We are going to look forward to seeing some of you perhaps at our next virtual discussion of the home place, which is centered on the theme of the relevance of race in the home place. And that will be with special guest Linda Thompson, who is the New Hanover County Chief Diversity and Equity Officer. And that'll be on August 10th at 12:30. So thank you again. This was a lovely discussion.
You're welcome, Kristen. Thanks a lot. It was fun.
Thank you.